Law and order only applies downward. We've all heard the retort, a rich man gets away with things that the poor man doesn't. Okay, so we've all heard that. And it has actually been studied and fleshed out. So let's look into this. According to Matua Michael Parenti, the now deceased Matua Michael Parenti, I might add, as of recently, peace be upon him, rest in peace and all of those things, to the great Matua sage and Tohunga himself, the criminal justice system inevitably serves the interests of elites. That is what his thesis was. And so one of the things that he talked about was a remarkable thesis known as the economics of the US Constitution, or just for short, the economics of the Constitution, since many Americans like to refer to their Constitution as simply the Constitution, because it's an insular conversation, you see. So anyway, the economics of the US Constitution was something that he often talked about, and it basically gets into the material motivations of the people that crafted the US Constitution. And one of the most striking features is that when read bluntly and plainly, the US Constitution does not abolish slavery. In fact, it defends, justifies, and institutionalizes it. Now, of course, later people came along, for example, Matua Lysander Spooner, who said, we can read this in a way that is emancipatory, that says that actually the US Constitution does not condone slavery. That was Matua Lysander Spooner's reading of it, but it required bringing external theories to the text rather than simply letting the text speak for itself. Of course, this gets into Matua Jacques Derrida's notion of deconstruction and difference. Basically, the idea that a text can more or less mean anything. Objectively speaking, it is ultimately meaningless. Why is this? Because Matua Jacques Derrida is drawing upon the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, who basically talked about how every word gains its meaning by pointing to another word. That's basically it. A signifier and signified. And as the nature of etymology happens, that being words change in meaning, they assigned different meanings in different words. Ultimately, the meaning of a text changes over time. Hence, the many denominations of Christianity, or even, when you think about it, Islam. Now, why is any of this important? It's important because it shows that there is a lot of room to interpret any text, including the US Constitution, and yet it is consistently interpreted in a way that benefits and serves the interests of power and of elites and so on and so forth. So that is number one to take into account. Number two, many groups are often demonized, particularly minority groups, such as African Americans, for example, as having a higher crime rate per capita. And again, Matua Michael Parenti gets into this in his work, The Myth of the Crime Wave. And another person that brilliantly tackles this issue and deconstructs it is Matua Bernard Aku, which he talks about in his book, Praxis, Theory and Praxis, that when we take into account that whites have the higher crime rate in total, whereas blacks have the higher crime rate per capita, at least according to the popular narrative, then it means that whites are more likely to commit crime than blacks. However, not because there is anything inherently wrong with white people. That is not what Matua Bernard Aku is saying, but rather simply because there is more of them. There is going to be more of them doing all kinds of things, including bad things. In other words, the per capita story is a value judgment. And the moment you make a value judgment, that is subjective. And furthermore, when we introduce Matua Karl Popper into the equation, we realize that the per capita narrative is BS. Why is that? Because it is a proposition that is non-falsifiable. A science is when you take a hypothesis and you disprove it. You cannot disprove that group X has more criminals in it than group Y, because the nature of crime is secret. Criminals, by their vocation, hide who they are. They pose as legitimate workers, business people, so on and so forth. The purpose of hiding a body is to hide a body. So, therefore, as fleshed out by Matua Bernard Aku, all we can demonstrate is that Group X is policed more, not that they necessarily commit more crime. That is what is shown by the data when we let the data speak for itself. And in this way, it makes total sense because it serves the interests of elites in keeping the working masses, the workers and tenants and debtors of both the nation and of the world, divided.